Hiya folks, how are you keeping? Thanks very much for coming out this evening. We're really excited to have you here. My own name's Caleb. I'm John's campaign manager for the upcoming election. We've got an exciting evening. We just brought our first set of our policies out today. 111 examples of actions that John would like to take if you grant him the opportunity to be your next mayor. So over the evening, what we're planning to do is John will give a bit of a run through of his priorities, his idea for Limerick, his vision, how we deliver more for Limerick. We're going to break into a panel then with some really insightful thoughts and some really cool people. And then from there, we'll open it up to the floor for any questions, thoughts or ideas that you have. And John and the panel will be there to give them an answer. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to the man himself, John Moran.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure if I'll end up wandering all over the place or staying here, but I'll try starting here for a minute because I presume that video is going to be on me. Listen, a really great thank you all to everybody coming tonight again. I can recognise some faces that were in Newcastle West, which was super to see. We didn't frighten you off first time. But for you, it'll be a little easier to follow some of the early part of this presentation just because it'll have been in a context, so I might just repeat a little bit of that for the other people. A really big thank you, just a couple of quick ones to Johnny and all his team for giving us the holla for this evening's event, and also for organising there'll be sandwiches and things like that later. But if anybody gets too hungry in the middle of the presentations, just grab a sandwich or a glass of drink. We're going to do this fairly casually today. I suppose we feel like we've reached a new part of the campaign at this stage. I think everybody knows that this is the first time that Limerick has to vote for its own mayor. And as I was saying to the people on the radio interview just a little bit ago, one of the really important things about choosing a mayor is not just who the person is and what they can do, but what their vision is for the Limerick that we want to live in. Because they're going to be doing this for 5 years, and that's long enough to make a really big difference in terms of where we're going. So what we're going to try and start doing over the course of the next couple of weeks is to set out different parts of effectively a collection of policies that we'd like to see. Once the mayoral election takes place, one of the first jobs that the mayor has to do is to set out a mayoral programme for the next 5 years, which is a pretty big tall order. As somebody who's done this and worked with sort of programme for governments at national level, that's not the easiest thing to do in terms of the complexity of it. And you'll see in the document that you have already what to do. So we're going to try and do 4 different sessions like this. Essentially, we've already talked at our launch about the need for Limerick to be more ambitious, and I'll come back to that in the presentation. We clearly are tonight going to talk about how you make Limerick the most desirable place to live in the country. And that's not an unrealistic dream, as you'll see when you look at some of the things we have to do. But we have to actually live the future and not be afraid of it. And I think a lot of people have been telling me that, like, we can't change in Limerick and we can't actually, get things to work differently. And I said, there's absolutely no reason for that not. And we've got to live that ambition, not the fear of change as we go through the next couple of years. We're going to try and talk about housing today. This has got to be the biggest scourge of Ireland in this decade, and how we might take a different approach down in Limerick. And again, using this office of a mayor to convince the Department of Housing that we might want to do things a little bit differently down here in Limerick, and to just let us on to do it. Next week, we're going to talk about a more prosperous Limerick, which is really about jobs, but it's about equal opportunity to opportunities across our city and across our county. We will then go on to talk about a more healthy Limerick, and obviously a lot of people in this room know about UHL, but we want to talk about more than UHL, about how we actually twist our lives around a little bit so that we become more active and actually deal with health issues before they become a crisis, but also deal with some of the things that can be done with UHL and primary care. And then finally, I suppose the most important piece for me is, and I should have said that this will take place here, that one is going to be in Adair. We'll go to Kilmallock for the healthy one, and then we'll come back to the city centre for May 9th. So we'll have a bit of a tour for those of you who want to come on a tour of the county with us on this all as we go along. At the launch, I suppose, one of the things I really wanted to reiterate was this the sense that I have, particularly because I've traveled to other places and seen things change a lot more quickly, perhaps than here, that sometimes in Limerick we're almost afraid of ambition. And we're afraid of doing things big. We're afraid of being the best of anything. I think we kind of, you know, it was once put to me by Trish Long from Disney that Limerick has spent a lot of its time trying to be a poor photocopy of someplace else, which I thought was a lovely image. I mean, whether it's of Galway, depending on how we think of students, or of Cork, or even of Dublin. And it wasn't like that before. Like when effectively Limerick was only a tiny little town in the 13th century, you know, they decided to build one of the biggest Norman castles in the country here in Limerick. When it got to the Georgian period, one of the most transformational Georgian new cities was actually built here in Limerick. And I really want you to think about that, because we're going to come back to why I think we can repeat some of the exercises that were done there in terms of the housing stuff. And then you kind of walk around Limerick at the moment, and I'm sorry to say it, but I don't see the same level of ambition in terms of how we do stuff. And I think that's where we now have an opportunity to reach out into the political process, into the political election, and really demand, whether it's of me or whether it's of the other candidates, really demand more of what we want from Limerick. I mean, this is one of our main streets up from Brown Thomas, and that's we actually had a photograph of that I had taken 2 years ago, and it didn't work for the presentation, and we were able to go and take the same photograph again. So things just aren't moving on as they should do. Now, I want to put Limerick in a context that's probably not the way we've thought of it before, but not in a negative way. I want to sort of show the opportunity that we have based on what's happening nationally. So this is actually the way Ireland has grown for the last 100 years. You know, it's about the best visual representation of it I've seen. And the only thing I'm missing is poor old Waterford, which wasn't on the graphic I used, right? But you actually see Limerick right over in the middle of the other cities. And we have a lot of regard for the GAA, but I think one of the things they do for Ireland, and the fact that the GAA is aligned to counties, is that we tend to think of everything in county terms rather than in economic regional terms. And when I put this slide up a number of years ago, it was actually to prove just how centrally located Limerick is in about 1 million or 1.5 million people. So in a sense, it's as big as Dublin, and with the proper roads to Galway and stuff like that, the travel time to get from Galway to the centre of Limerick and even down to Cork with improvements in the road there is not that much more than getting from the top part of Dublin down to the bottom part of Dublin. And if you're over in China and you're looking at this, or in San Francisco, you don't see the difference between Cork and Waterford. And at the time I said, well, we in Limerick should describe our area as having Apple and Eli Lilly and all those places when we think about it. And the reason for that was because it was really likely that these companies would understand that they need to reach out to the talent pool in all of that area. And here we are 2 years later, and Eli Lilly have just done that by moving and putting a second operation within that framework. And we'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about the prosperity, but one of the great things about being in the middle is that your economy diversifies into different areas. You pick up a little bit of the medtech that's up in Galway, you pick up a little bit of the pharmaceuticals that's in Cork, and you end up then with a much more resilient region. So that if you lose one factory, you don't necessarily have the same trauma that we had to go through when we lost places like Down. We now have a government that is seriously looking at the train network, which I think is a very welcome development. But if you look at this, where we're now down to 2 hours, it's not inconceivable that the train system could be speeded up a little bit we don't need the French TGVs because the spaces are not actually as long, but it could just be an hour from Dublin to Limerick. And Limerick then is in the centre of this other area. So you think about that in a completely different way. You think about people coming from Dublin down for medical services to Limerick instead of us having to go up, if the government was enlightened enough to actually do that kind of stuff. The most important backdrop to everything I need to talk about is the fact that right off our shores, in this little barrier here, there is enough electricity to power not just Ireland once, but Ireland about 8 times, which means that the country becomes not an importer of electricity and not an importer of fuel to actually generate our own electricity, but actually an exporter of electricity. So it's kind of a little bit like finding oil off the West Coast. And imagine the impact of that if you could kind of roll back the clock and go to Dundee before they found oil, and what happened right around that space at that time. It will transform parts of West Limerick in Foynes and others, as I said in the paper here. Now, when we were doing the development in Colbert Quarter, had been talking about a lot of these things in terms of Irish policy. But one of the things I learned when I was in Dublin is that sometimes you need to bring somebody in from outside to actually tell you the same things that you already know from their backdrop, and then people believe it more than when they listen to their own, right? And Brent Tuderian was actually the city planner for Vancouver, which, as people know, is one of the cities in the world that people flock to and want to live in, even though it has grown very fast, just because they have approached the planning of their urban space, the planning of where people live, very differently. And these are the messages he gave us when we were doing Colbert, which is sort of, this changing of the conversation about how we actually live. He already identified Colbert, as we did, to have remarkable potential. In the same way as he identified places in Vancouver, he wanted us to listen to the youth, because we want a young city, and we have to listen to the kind of a city, as you can see, that they look for different types of public realm. And if we design our city for kids first, we actually design a city and a county for everybody. Because once it works for kids, it works for parents. There are some other important things that we need to focus on public health, and again, we'll come back to that in our other area. We can do density much better and well, and you'll understand later in the presentation why that's important. But I suppose the most important message he said to me was that if you look at the top, is that you need political will and energy to actually do anything. And I can see it in the Colbert Quarter, because for a year or so while I was, or 2 years then, chair of the LDA, we made huge advances in the Colbert Quarter. And then there were no Limerick members on the board anymore, and it seems to grind to a halt. And so we need to use this new mayoral election to actually reignite that kind of political will and energy to move forward. Now, I put these up actually about 10 years ago in a presentation to the City Council when I asked the senior managers, which Limerick do they want to actually have? And you'll understand why, because at the time we were fighting about O'Connell Street and what O'Connell Street should look like. The middle city is actually right in Paris. The third city is Vancouver. And in a funny sort of way, we have a lot of all of those in Limerick, right? We have sort of the river of Vancouver, we have nice streets, we have actually a really nice city, and we have an even nicer county just around it. And I think sometimes we can forget that, because people have for years been talking about these kind of problems in Limerick, all of which are solvable with the right energy and the right time. 2015, in that same presentation that I gave to the City Council, this is what I was asking for. So anyone that thinks I'm now asking for new stuff is not actually following along. I've been now nearly 9 or 10 years trying to ask for the stuff that are in the booklet that we have today. The importance of family, the importance of preserving our past in terms of our heritage. There's no reason why Limerick can't continue to have the best schools in the country, right? Why we can't have the best leisure options. All of these little things put together reach to the point where we become the best place to live in Ireland. You can work your way through all of these later, but you'll see them reflected in the document. But a really important one that's, I think, become really important again for us in Limerick, and I know there are some people here who are traders in the city centre and experience this on a daily basis, is the sense of security that you actually need to feel when you go for a walk in the park, or when you go into the city, or when you just go for a walk even around your own neighbourhood. This is a hard slide for people that are doing public policy in Ireland to sort of acknowledge, because we have done and managed success so badly in this country. We're actually a great country for dealing crises, to be honest. We've done them a couple of times, and our system just actually does a good job of managing, whether it's a COVID crisis, a financial crisis, or others. Well, we do success really badly. We don't manage success. And what I want us to think about for Limerick is Limerick, for all the reasons I just described, within the lifetime of many people here, could be a city of 300,000. Ireland has grown by 1 million people, so if we're not getting 10% or 20% of that, we're not actually succeeding as the third city. But how do you actually add 50,000 or 100,000 people to a city of 100,000? And what I want us to think about is, what would our city look like with 300,000 people? What would it work? What would we need in terms of services? And then for the 50,000 that we need to add between now and 2040, let's add them into a city that works for 300,000. Because the answer isn't the same as adding 50,000 to a city that's going to stop at 150,000 in terms of the choices you make for land use and everything else. And there's another reason for doing that, because if you are successful at it, you could find yourself needing to 100,000 and not be ready. So in the order of 300,000 with blocks of people, you are getting ready for growth in a way that stops house prices getting too large, in a way that stops you getting into congestion or schools that are too full and things like that. And this is a shocking example of the difference between if you grow at 10% and if you grow at 2%. But Ireland is growing much faster than Limerick at the moment. So if we started to rise on that blue line, we would find ourselves with problems worse than Dublin and worse than the other cities for lack of services, because we're not going to be ready for it. And the choices we've got to make will have to be made as early as 2 or 3 years from now. This is actually what Limerick would look like. So you can kind of get the guess. This is the built-up Limerick, right? It's kind of bizarrely structured, right? Most cities, you tend to think of them as round cities. We've allowed it to move out in these directions, mainly because, of course, we had a split authority. So we had the county driving on the edge of the city, and we had the city centre not working well. That, I'll show you, is actually a real opportunity for us in terms of a growth city. But these are two diagrams that got done for me by architects, where this is roughly growing Limerick for 200,000 people as we have it at the moment. And for those of you who haven't worked it out already, this is the road, the road to the motorway, basically. So this is how much of the land below that we will lose if we actually want to do this. This is the alternative, where we build our city actually roughly the same as George and Limerick. We're not talking Hong Kong skyscrapers here. We're talking buildings of 4 or 5 or 6 stories, which most architects will tell you is a perfect rough size for residential accommodation. We'll talk a little bit about this later, and I'll be interested to hear the views. But the difference with this city is this is all the land that we need to add, much of which we already have. That's my Ross. This is the Docklands. Here is the whole area around Colbert and the rest. And it takes 15 minutes to cycle from here to Colbert Quarter. And we've got a pretty flat city, right? It's a bit of a wet city at times, but nonetheless, it's actually a lot flatter than places like Cork, so it gives us huge advantages. This is a German city with less than 300,000 people, but very close to 300,000 people. They've gone and managed their city, and you can see how they've structured their city compared to the one we've just been allowed to develop over time. It's much more condensed, it's much more organized, I suppose not that surprising given that it's in Germany. But the amazing thing for me is this is what it looks like. They've put the cars that people live in at the edges of their areas. So you can pay for parking if you live in places, and you walk and you travel through streets that look just like that. Now imagine that in the Georgian Quarter, in between our Georgian buildings as a way to live. And it's sort of funny because and this is why I go back to this Georgian period in Limerick that's really important. It was an incredibly well-designed part of the city because these urban blocks are so flexible. They allow you to put little parks in between buildings. They allow you to add one block with another block if you want to for a larger facility or whatever. And in Spain, what they've done is this was what they have. Everyone will recognize it from Limerick, particularly Rockies, right up in the middle of it, right? And they said, no, let's identify different functions for the streets. So we'll give little blocks of 9 blocks, which will become their own little neighborhoods within the streets. And we'll build our city in Barcelona with all of those. We have exactly the same thing in the middle of Limerick, right? And if I superimpose the car park of the shopping centre on top of this, it would actually be way bigger. So anybody that says you can't walk from here to Brown Thomas, most people in this room probably go to the Crescent Shopping Centre and they walk further when they park their car and they walk across the shopping centre. So you have to think of a city a bit differently. And the opportunity is just watching and facing us, because look where all our car parks are. They're at the edge of that area. So we can actually conceive of a city that works very differently within the centre. Now, coming back to the huge opportunity that Limerick has in terms of urban planning, this is the way we think of cities, where you put everything in the middle. It gets too expensive, And people have to live further and further from the outside, or you just go with these really high buildings. Really poor design to actually do growth. This is what Ireland has done at the Irish level. We've done this in Dublin, and everyone else is kind of eking off of Dublin, right? This is the way that the Netherlands is organized. It's organized with different cities connected to each other, all roughly the same. I mean, you don't complain too much if somebody asks you to move to Amsterdam or Rotterdam or Utrecht or The Hague, because they're all interesting cities of their own and they're not feeding off of one single city. Now, you can do the same thing at the level of a city or a county. I spent a lot of time working with KPMG before the last development plan, coming up with a design for Limerick, and I'm shocked when I have these presentations how many people in Limerick either A, don't know this is the actual plan of the council, or I haven't been thinking of Limerick that way. This is the Raheen Doyle Circle, this is my Ross, and this is Castletroyan University. Each of those are, roughly speaking, what we call a 15-minute walkable city. You can cross across them, do everything. And we should have within each of those circles almost everything you would want. Shops, restaurants, you should work there, your jobs. And to the extent that your partner or spouse works somewhere else, or your kid wants to go to a specialty, music generation sort of, class, and that might be in one of the others, you connect those up by public transport so you can get around quickly. The important thing for Limerick is that the other circle that we have in the middle, which is another one of these 15-minute walkables, for a lot of cities that want to do growth, their problem is that this is actually too powerful and these are too weak. With Limerick as a growing population, we can take all of that and turn it to our advantage, because actually what we need to do with the city centre now is bring it up to the level of the other three. Don't bring it too high. Bring it to the level of being a historic residential area with jobs and administration and whatever else, but it will feel and be different than the other three, with the result that people who work in healthcare or work in Raheen will sort of have a locus here, people who are focused on the university over here, and we have now got two circles with two universities. Most cities would kill for one. There are people in the room here who probably remember when we were killing for one down here in Limerick, and now we have two, right? And then we build up the city centre with all the spaces that we have. And then it branches out. So what you get after that then is you start adding your population around the new train stations. We know we're at Patrick's Well, there's one here, there's supposed to be one in Adair. And as you add your population, you can add it into these different places on what's called transport-oriented development. Now, in my actual plan, I've sort of got a new term, which I call fun-oriented development, which I think is a totally different way of looking at it, but you can put the two together. And if you put the fun where the transport is, then people can actually live where the fun is, and then they're also living near the transport, or they're going to the transport and the fun. I thought this was a really great word cloud from our Colbert thing. It just was a good reminder a couple of years ago about what the people of Limerick actually wanted when it came to their housing around there. And this is the kind of design work that we originally had planned for there with the architects we brought in. And again, you'll see reflections of what we've talked about. I think a lot of people in the room know that I'm particularly unhappy about what they actually have produced as the first draft of that area. And I think we need to sort of do a serious job about revisiting that. Among the things they did, instead of this broken up, this neighbourhood that flows around St. Joseph's Hospital with industry and with housing, for some reason, I as yet don't know, the LDA have agreed to split the site, give the HSE one side, put social housing on the other side, and a big walled fence in the middle of the two, which is reminiscent of some of the bad planning that happened out in my Ross. So that's probably one of the first things I'll be making a phone call if I'm lucky enough to get elected to the LDA to change that. But again, going back to the ambition, it's interesting that this design and the one afterwards was done by an architect based in Limerick for us, but he's a Polish architect based in Limerick, who I think was able to look at Limerick very differently than we do ourselves. And when he started to think about the plaza in front of Colbert, and it has improved from what it used to be, but I think it has a lot to go, this is the kind of stuff he saw in Colbert. These paths going up here are probably the most exciting part of his design, because that's what they then put over the train stations. These are the cycle paths, these are the walking areas. This is a viewing area, the old crane. If anyone went to Secretary or the Prize, you'll recognize it. And you actually then build your housing around it. And this was achievable by the next 15 or 20 years, because that's how fast the places in Dublin are actually transforming. The one big message I have in the document is let's not panic. We know we need housing. We know we needed housing before. People will remember when we actually took over very valuable public land just because we needed housing in it, and it was easy to do. And we spent decades trying to actually unwind that decision. So again, we have to be careful that we do it well. When we set up what was originally Liveable Limerick, the NGO, these were the images we had for O'Connell Street, not what we currently have, right? So we have two problems with O'Connell Street at the moment. I think it's actually been done really badly. Everybody knows my dad was a builder. Water logging in front of a step with a thing coming into it, that's not good building. And this has cost us a fortune to do. The other side, it's probably a really good indication to me about O'Connell Street and its success by the fact that our very own tourist office closed down on the street. So I think we need to really re-examine sort of stuff. This has actually been an analogy we've been using a little bit, which is that when we set our ambition higher in sport, we've shown we can do it. And I think we can do the same thing in City Hall. Now, I'm not going to go through these in great detail. People can read the document that we have about it. But I'll just try and explain the structure and some of the things that we've been thinking about in our plan, right? So the first and most important thing at the moment is affordable housing in the city. And I think it needs a radical change. It needs a major state intervention in order to do that, to bring costs of rental down. But it needs to be done in tandem with the private sector. We can't do one or the other. You need to do both, right? There is one thing that has been really upsetting a lot of us for the last couple of years, is that we believe the targets from the Department of Housing that they needed in terms of annual growth were too low, at 30,000. We argued that it was closer to 50,000, and I'm hearing the noises lately coming out of Dublin is that it is actually 50 or 60,000. That's 3 years wasted in this crisis. But more importantly, as soon as you set the targets at the right level with a credible plan to deliver, everybody knows that houses are not going to be scarce at some point in the near future, and the pressure comes off a lot of things and prices drop straight away. You don't even need to build one house. You just have to have a credible plan to deliver the right number. And so the clearest indication that the Housing for All targets were wrong was that the market shares of housing companies did not go down. They expected houses to stay up because they expected a shortage. So there's a load of stuff we can do here in terms of delivering Colbert Quarter. And I would love to actually use public housing to try different type of housing. Rather than try and convince the private sector to be doing it, why can't we have public housing in an apartment that's pet friendly? Why can't we have public housing for health workers? It used to be there before. When we needed health workers in the regional hospital, we provided houses for the nurses that were working there. We can use private or our public housing, of which we need an awful lot, to actually try and do that. For well explained, I hope, Limerick has such a potential, but we can actually get to this most desirable place in Limerick to live, and we need to do it. And we're very lucky, because it's a bit like having the Olympics. We have a Ryder Cup coming up. So by the time of the Ryder Cup, we need to showcase a really brilliant Limerick. And that gives us a deadline to actually get stuff done, with a real deadline. And I think there's a possibility, if you think about the problem with our housing, we're going to also have thousands of people coming into work, thousands of people coming in at that time for a short period of time. We need to provide them with modular housing and stuff like that. We should do it on state land. And when the Ryder Cup is over, we will not tear it down. We'll use it to transition us to a more permanent basis with a lot of housing all of a sudden available uniquely in Limerick. And I would love to have a Welcome to Limerick office, which actually encourages people to come to Limerick and actually makes it easier for them, not only just to be here, but to stay here, to find schools for their kids, maybe in advance, and a lot of other stuff like that. Safety is a huge important thing in our document. There's a chunk of cash being given to the mayor. I think one of the things that they can actually spend it on until we can figure out how to get the Department of Justice to give us the guards we want is to actually just put some security into our parks and onto our streets. The stuff that's going on in the greenery out in Castletroy shouldn't be happening. If we have to do that with public sector workers from the local authority, let's do that until we can actually figure it out without letting them off the hook. And that's why this will be an agenda item every 6 months for me with all the ministers, so that security and the guards are actually important. But I think we can do an awful lot in the way we work our streets. The use of public lighting, the taking down metal grills from shops and encouraging that by giving rates exemptions to people, so that when you walk down the street at night, the lights of the shops are still on. You're actually ambling down and looking at window shopping again rather than looking at grills. And that makes it actually safer for other people that are leaving and going home late at work to do that. We can be using our laneways way more effectively than we currently are. This is a visual done for me of actually watching a movie in the laneway behind number 2 Perry Court. We could also, I think, do a lot more for some of the schools in our city that are coping with some of the kids with the greatest disadvantages. Last night I was at a charity event, and we were talking about the impact of a very small amount of money into my Ross in terms of the primary school there and supporting them. We know we need more theatres. We know we need more places for people to do plays. So why not let's actually design and plan, because maybe we won't have them built, 1 or 2 new theatres beside the schools that actually need the most help, so that their kids can actually, take some of the same advantages as other kids have. Another little one I've mentioned is I think that in our new Limerick, I think it's important that we actually have a new culture house. If you go to Conran or Gaeilge at the moment, you see a building that's not been well looked after and not enforced. But let's expand that so that this becomes a place where we celebrate all the cultures. Our public realm has to look very different in Limerick, okay? I would love to finish off O'Connell Street, but I think you've got the earlier slides. It won't look the same if I can have any, impact into the design. And there's a sort of a lucky break at the moment, because where the Rugby Museum is, it's sort of the end of the retail, so I think there's an opportunity to do the rest of George and O'Connell Street differently. And we have a park concept where we would actually spread the People's Park all the way over to Henry Street, so that the streets would actually look more like the streets of Freeburg I mentioned earlier, around the greening of things, which is actually part of the council's plans in the last development plan. It's just we haven't seen very much action on it. If you travel around Limerick, you'll realise that there's a whole potential for new parks that we don't have. There's some up by the river going up to Partine. There's a large estate in the middle of my Ross, which could be a Curragh Chase on the north side. And then there is my own favourite, which is South Hill, which is one of the nicest places to look at Limerick, because you're right on the hill looking down over the hill, and there's no reason why we couldn't have a public park up there. And this could be our train system. I still reckon that we could sort of get one of those out to UL from the Parkway or something like that. But we are really lucky, as I said earlier, because we already have the rail lines. If you hear the agony that the poor lads in Dublin are going through trying to get a metro up to the airport, and we sit here looking at the railway lines and we don't fix them and put trains on them. I spent a bit of time with Jim Mead, who runs Irish Rail, who's convinced me that it's kind of like buying a train set for Christmas, but for adults, right? Because you don't need to electrify rail in Limerick. You just buy battery-operated trains. And they can get from Ennis to Nina, and you drop the battery, put a new one on, and come back in. It's an incredibly quick way to have one of the best, effectively, suburban train systems in Limerick. Because if you compare it to, say, places like Galway, which have historically only got one line in, Limerick has these lines all radiating out the city centre, going to the other areas, as we've seen. I still haven't found the traffic management plan. I've been looking for it, but it'll need an updating for some of this. But again, we need to have a traffic management plan that is much more robust and explains to people how we're actually going to run the city. One of my own favourites, obviously, is that we need to do more on heritage assets. We haven't looked after our heritage assets in Limerick, and we have so many of them. It's just amazing the competitive advantage we could have for tourism, but more importantly for ourselves, just actually in terms of enjoyment, looking at this. I was at an event in Bruff, I guess now 2 nights ago, where for 4 years they've been waiting for the Bank of Ireland building, which is effectively given to the town of Bruff, to actually be converted into an enterprise centre. We just need to speed this stuff up and actually deliver this stuff. The medieval mansion in Kilmallock is the same. They have the money. It's just somebody's fighting over whether they own the front or the back, and it's not somebody in the private sector. It's the OPW and the city, or I should say the county and the city, in terms of Limerick Council. We just need to move on with that stuff. And this could be an amazing facility right in the middle of Kilmallock for customer service. I think that there's a way, and I started to talk to some people at a housing event recently on this. We have this system for first-time buyers where we actually lend them money to buy into a house that they can't quite afford, and the state effectively takes equity that they can buy back. The same system could be used for the renovating of Georgian houses and other houses across town. It's very hard to get a bank to actually give you enough money to renovate a house in Ireland because they don't believe you'll finish the project or they don't believe it'll have the full value that it might have. So the state can step in and say, we'll buy 20 or 30% of that project. And then, if you want, you can actually buy us back in a number of years. The same thing as we're doing for first-time buyers. And one of the things I've learned in Dublin that is really very helpful when you're in public policy looking for new ideas is if you can base it on something they already have, they can move much more fast. And this is an exact example of taking an existing scheme that's been used for a different purpose and applying it to another purpose. And the last item is really this thing about fun. Right? Everybody loves living in a place that's fun. And I think we've sometimes forgotten that. Right? Our streets aren't used for fun in the same way as before. Right? I think we also are missing a gig here in terms of the way we think of our stadium. And I'm not going to promise that I'm going to deliver a municipal stadium or even that's the right thing to do, but I would like to do a study that analyzes what's the right use of a larger stadium for Limerick in terms of the 3 or 4 different sports that we have, the cultural events and everything else, and where might that location be that works for everyone else. One of the chaps in the room here pointed out to me, because we were a big fan of doing street feasts on the streets, that the city is now charging volunteers who decide to do street feasts on the street what is still a relatively small amount, but it's a very large amount for the organisers. So I just think from the budgetary perspective, that should be waived. And in fact, the city should help on providing insurance cover, which is very often the obstacle to actually doing some of that stuff, because smaller groups in the States or in towns or villages across the county, they don't have the expertise, nor indeed the ability to go and get insurance. The state should just simply provide an umbrella cover and maybe charge them a nominal fee. And my own favourite, which we've been pushing since 2015, and I know there's some people here, so you'll be glad I kept the best wine to last, is that when we were looking to do something new in the Hunt Museum, we came up with this idea of having, because our collection was all about collections, our museum was all about collections, is having a collection of games. We would actually have the first gaming museum, certainly in Ireland, but probably in Europe, of a significant scale where we'd have medieval games and Georgian games. We know we had Atari once, we would have Atari games, and we could have the most cutting edge games. It could fit in the Franciscan church for a while. I know there's 2 volunteers already in the middle of the room here from UL that loved the idea when they heard this. But we thought that was a brilliant idea to set Limerick apart. And I would wager that most of us, if we went in there once, would want to go back there again. And over again with our friends. And they don't need friends to visit, we'd be looking for excuses to go there. And putting something like that down in Henry Street in the old Franciscan Hall would bring a lot of this together, right? We'd use an old building we're not using. We'd create a dynamic right in the city centre that would not only just attract people into the city centre, but would make you want to live in George and Limerick. So you just have to walk down to the gaming museum after you finish work for an hour or something. I don't know how many times people have said to me over the last 5 or 6 years in Limerick that these things can't be done. They always seem to think about or have a fear of doing stuff. And I just wanted to put these images up of the actual, the Hunt Museum garden, because we face so many obstacles to this when we tried to do this idea. Bring down the railings, open up the museum, create a different type of garden. We were going to have antisocial behaviour. We were going to have all sorts of problems. This garden works, right? It now is fully integrated into the community in St. Mary's and Kings Island, who actually grow their vegetables or their seedlings in the garden, in the greenhouse, and take them out to St. Mary's for them to grow, into the St. Mary's Park to actually grow. And I'm hoping that this year again, there'll be the same festival there was last year, where they had all of the potatoes together and everybody cooked a big massive meal with the potatoes that had started in this garden. And we could be doing a whole lot more of that right across the county if we actually just have a little bit more ambition and a little bit more bravery. So I'll leave it at that. We're going to take questions afterwards. these three people are going to come up and critique this whole plan now for you, to give you some ideas about further questions to ask. And then once we do that, we'll kind of try and bring this to a halt, and we'll actually just stick around and ask more questions for those that want to do it. I'm going to ask you when we get through this little panel discussion to not be shy, right? Chloe will probably have the first question anyway, I suspect, up the front, my niece, because she's never been shy about this stuff. But no, but just ask questions, because this stuff is in some ways complex. In other ways, it's relatively easy. So can I ask you guys to come up? Thanks, Ron.
Hello, everybody. My name is Barbara Carr. I'm an architect in Limerick with my husband, Seamus. So I look at Limerick from the point of view of an architect, but also somebody who's lived in the city for 7 years with my family and just loved living there, as my kids did. Walked around to school, down to the park. So easy to get everywhere. But I think of the photographs of the Lawrence collection. Who knows those photographs from early 20th century? They show old scenes of every city, every village around the country. But they also show streets that are teeming with life. There's carriages everywhere, people walking in every direction. That's what we need to get back again, I think. People on the streets. Does anybody here live in Limerick City? One?
You're in
Two,
Patrick's well now, yeah.
Three. Does anybody go into the city at night time? One, two, three. Because I think John's idea of making it more attractive to walk around and be at night time is something that's a very simple idea. You know, when I looked through this, first of all, I thought, oh, I need to lie down. It's so ambitious, but it's really exciting in its ambition. And yet, to start getting some of those steps realised, you need to take action. So the very simple idea of making the city more attractive at night time by giving a rent rebate to those businesses that keep their windows without shutters and lit at night time, I thought that's a really simple idea. That's really doable. So I love those clever ideas. I was at an architects' meeting this morning, and I discovered that Limerick City and County Council, which is now combined, has 19 architects. And I thought, wow, I used to work for what was Limerick Corporation back in the 80s, and we were 3 architects at the time. But now there's a real chance to deliver really good quality housing, and you can see pockets of it appearing in the city. But we also need a visionary plan. And just listening to what John was saying there, I really think we have it. I love the idea of fun-oriented development. And I agree that you really need to bring private developers on as well as the government or local authority housing, because private developers are a necessary part of the whole equation, and they have to be encouraged. I suppose I shall hand it over to the 2 panelists here, but I think this vision for the city is really, really exciting, and I would love to see John in a position where he can actually push this forward. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dylan Flynn. I think the reason that I'm up here is a little bit different than the other 2 panelists, but I suppose
to tell you songs.
To tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a Limerick-based musician. I've lived in the city centre for the last 3 years, and I work as a music educator for Music Generation Limerick County. So I've done some work here in Patrickswell, in the community centre across the road. I've worked in Kilmallock, I've worked in Newcastle West, Abbeyfield, and many of the other places and towns around Limerick County. I suppose the first time John got in contact with me was when he heard one of the songs that I had written that came out on an album of ours last year, and it was a song called Nowhere to Live. And that song, I think, touched a lot of people, and it seemed to speak to John as well. And that's why he reached out to me. And I suppose I'm here to give my voice as a young person living in the city centre to talk about what needs to be done to help the housing crisis, rising rents, homelessness in the city, and how the Limerick City Centre can be transformed into somewhere that's not just a place for people to come in on the weekends, not just a place for young people to live before they get their new house, a place that families and everyone can settle down, where communities can be built, where streets can be used as not just places to park your car, but also places to hold multicultural events. And reading through John's plans, they're amazing. They make me excited, and I can't wait to see what comes to fruition, because, as John said, we're here to hold people accountable for what they've done, and listening to him, I think he's going to follow through with these plans if you give him the opportunity to become mayor. So thank you. I'll pass you over.
Hello, how are you? My name is Michael O'Connor. I'm from O'Connor Murphy Auctioneers in Limerick. I'm a chartered surveyor, and John gave me the easy job here today. He asked me to solve the supply crisis for housing in Limerick in 2 minutes. So first of all, well done, John. I thought it was a very informative presentation. But I suppose what I would say about the supply, at the moment we're running, I reckon, estimate around 1,000 units short a year in Limerick, roughly about 100 a month. I think there was about 2,200 units sold last year in Limerick. And I estimate we need about 3,500 a year. Now that's growing obviously all the time as we're not meeting the targets. The big fear that I always have with government getting involved with the housing and housing crisis, they need to be involved, but that it's always a knee-jerk reaction, and 9 times out of 10 it's the wrong way to react. If I was to ask anyone here how you solve the housing crisis, and not just yourselves, but most people, everyone has this vision of just rezoning land and building houses and continue building out and building out and building out. That's building estates, whereas really to build a city properly, I think you need to be building communities, and you need to be building neighbourhoods. And I think the first place you start when you start looking at supply is you got to look at what you have today and what you can do with it. And what I mean by that is really fit for purpose in one way. The colleges in Limerick, if you were to drive around the surrounding estates, the students are all living in houses in Limerick. Why not start by building student accommodation in all these areas, free up all those houses and apartments, and get renters and owner-occupiers into these units immediately? There's always going to be the long-term and the short-term problem, and it's easy to talk about the long-term problem, how to solve the long-term. The short-term that's all fine, but what do you do in the meantime is always the question. I think John mentioned the modular. I think we have to look at it. The state in Limerick that I'm aware of, and I don't think I have it all, they own Mungrove College, they own land in Clorina, they own the Colbert area that John mentioned. So if you've seen modular buildings in other countries, I mean, you wouldn't actually know they're modular when you see them. And it's as John actually mentioned as well, when you're finished with them, it's not that you don't throw them out. They have other uses, but it might solve something. I think also every incentive that's given from the government today is all given to owner-occupiers, which I'm not at all against, by the way. But I think in a way, the way they solved, their view of solving the rental crisis was cap rents, which I totally disagree with. I don't agree with the pressure zones at all. And I don't mean that against the tenants and the increasing rents. But the way they're doing it, that's not going to solve the increasing rents. I think you have to be fair to, a developer and a landlord seems to be a dirty word today. We need a private and a public sector coming together. We need joint thinking. If the government are giving money, like we have a shared equity scheme for owner-occupiers, that's not available to investors. But if you did make it available for investors, what I'm suggesting is that the government or the local council would have a shareholding within any block of apartments or houses, but that the tenants then would get a reduction in their rent, maybe of 30%, if the the council own 30% of the property, that the rent is reduced by 30%. And but as I said, we're not going to solve it here in a couple of minutes. But I think if I was to summarise, you look at what you have at the moment, fit for purpose. This idea of building estates around the suburbs and putting in 200 apartments. The way I look at apartments is that apartment living is only suitable if you don't need a car. That's just, I'm not saying you can't have a car, but so in other words, you have all the amenities and you're walking distance from everything. In Limerick, the idea of apartments is just to get high density. That's all it is. It costs, the surveyors did costings on building of apartments, and they estimate it costs 411,000 euros to build an apartment today in the Limerick region. An apartment in Limerick is probably, a new apartment has the value. We just sold some in Castle Troy for 305,000. So it's just not feasible. And that's why in the housing, what's Crinaha scheme, they're giving builders 144,000 of a subsidy so they can sell them on to owners. That's money that's never going to come back. Surely there's a more creative way of doing things that suits everyone. But I think we need to start, everything needs to be looked at, dissected, and a long-term, but very much a short-term plan needs to be put in place. And I think we don't have a choice but the modular style of building, like what they do in other countries, and get people into these units and charge very affordable rents. And it's all about supply and demand at the end. And if we can get the supply going, even on a temporary basis, you'll see the rents dropping then, and you'll see the price of houses dropping. But that's how we solve the problem, not getting rid of landlords and getting rid of the developers. We need them. Even this week, I was saying to John there yesterday, we were just chatting for a minute, and it was 8 yesterday, today it's 10. I spoke to 10 owners, or our office did, of second-hand houses, and 8 of those owners, they're all rented houses. So the reason they're getting out is the rent isn't even covering their mortgage. They can't increase their rent, and they've just had enough. So they're going to get vacant possession of those houses to sell them. They have to get vacant possession because the rent that they're at, their house will be devalued by 30 to 40%. So they've no choice to go through the whole process. Could take them 12 months in some cases. So by capping rents and doing it's not doing anyone any favours. I know the person that's in a house at the moment paying 800 a month or 1,000 a month, and the market rent is 2,000, thinks it's great. And I get that. I wish if I was. But overall, it's not solving anything. So that's really all I have to say, I suppose. Okay, I could talk a lot more about it, but that's all in the couple of minutes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, man. You guys want to... I'll just talk about one other idea that's in there that perhaps didn't get flushed out as much in the presentation, then we'll open it up to the floor, is that in analysing this, particularly my time in the LDA, one of the things we did was we studied other cities and other places. And I felt that in some ways the LDA could be that, but actually here in Limerick we have Limerick 2030, which is our own development company. And we have AHBs, and I was shocked to find out that the country actually has 500 AHBs, which is approved housing bodies that own houses. And yet you look at places like Vienna, where the state effectively becomes that large AHB and owns land. And I think it certainly is, from my perspective, a really interesting idea for Limerick to do its own thing in the context of dealing with the rental issues. Because the best way to get rid of the caps on rent is actually to no longer have rents that rise, because you automatically step out of that. So you don't even need to get derogation from Limerick. And in order to do that, you need to kind of combine this modular housing with a more permanent solution that you can transition to. And I would love to see being able to use the financing that we can get, the private developers, the private builders, to build housing, but that it actually remains in the ownership of the state. So that as the equity, and this is in some ways, if you look at the way the tunnel, which I, of course, am chair of, that goes back to the state in 2041. Once the financings are paid off, the tolls that are being paid by people at the moment are designed to actually repay effectively the mortgage on the building of the tunnel, because we didn't want to have to wait to save all the money first and then build a tunnel. So we borrowed from the European Investment Bank and others. And every time we go through with our toll, that helps to pay back the loans. And then in 2041, the loans are all paid off. And it's not some other private company that runs away with the tunnel. It actually goes directly back to the state. And I think it would be an amazing legacy of a directly elected mayor if they could start a scheme where they actually start owning social housing or public housing that is rented at an affordable enough rate that would bring down the rentals that aren't rising anymore, would improve the quality of what people are offering, because now they would have to compete with this other. In the short term, it could be provided with the modular housing idea. And then when that gets progressed into developments like the ones that I've proposed for Colbert and that, the people that are in effectively the modular housing would get the first right. There wouldn't be a lottery anymore. They would be able to move and say in the same field, whether it's in Clarina or whether it's in Mungret or in Myross or wherever, into the apartments that are there. But the rent that they would pay then for those apartments would pay back the loans that effectively the state, or let's call it Limerick, has. And in 30 or 40 years' time, when the loans are repaid, now the rent is being paid on property that we don't have a mortgage on. So it can actually be used to build more housing or to subsidise rent for other people, depending on why it is. And I think that there's a really interesting scheme there. And I'm talking several thousand apartments.
Well, are you talking about the equity share as well?
Well, the state would own, like it does schools. Yeah. I mean, it would get somebody to build the apartments, to run potentially the apartments, but be the owner of the apartments, like its own investment fund. And then as the money, because at the moment it pays off private investment funds, who then in 40 years' time own the building and have the rent with no mortgage, that the state would now own the building, would manage it as an area, whether it's in Colbert, whether it's in Myross or someplace else. It would be designed for what we want. And in effect, the rent that would be paid by the private individuals living there, who might want to have a pet and be in because they want to have a dog and they can't find private
I like that idea
or whatever else. But
it's
a type of way of proving housing that, in fact, the private sector is saying today they don't want to build, you know, or they have other things to do. And then after 30, 40 years, now we own it. And we own it free of a mortgage, which means that the rent that we now have, and this is what happens in Vienna, is the older stock of apartments are allowing them to provide rental that's below cost rental. It's funding new stuff, yeah. Yep. Now, I won't see the benefit of this. It'll be there in 30 or 40 years, but I think that would be an amazing legacy. Dylan will probably be mayor by then, you know, and like he'll be saying, thank you, John. You know. Well, what do you think? Vienna does it really well. I mean,
well, I think trying to get a marriage of public and private is a really exciting idea, but I do think that different models of how we build need to be explored. And I think that idea of certainly of some kind of equity share for private developers, or sorry, private individuals to try and top up building in the city. I know that's not just what you mentioned there, but you know, even for resurrecting parts of Limerick City, to be able to get some kind of equity by the local authority in it so they can afford to do it. Of thinking of the long term, where you have places, the government building and rents feeding into future building. I think looking at those different models is a really clever way of approaching it.
Yeah. On another point on that, I think it's we're very much set in Ireland, or we'll talk about Limerick, that we have to own our own house, and that you know that and. If you go back, if any of you have rented houses, or whether it's a landlord or a tenant, you're all signing the same lease document. That lease document must be, I don't know, must be 50, 60 years old at least when it was developed. But time has moved on, and I think that's what's caused a lot of the rental issues has come from that. Our mindset is that when we rent a house as a landlord or as an owner, you're renting it for 6 months or 12 months, and you give them this 4-page document of a lease. Whereas what it has to be, I think it has to get more like a commercial lease. I think you've got to give security and tenure to tenants. I mean, a commercial lease is 35 years. It's got 5 yearly rent reviews or 3 yearly rent reviews. And the tenant knows that they're there for that long period. The landlord knows that he's got the security, he or she has the security of the tenant, that the rent is going to continue coming in. And if the state was to take an equity share in something like that, and it was a figure of 30%, because that's what they're giving in other schemes they're doing, that the state now also have their partners with the private enterprise, and they're getting 30% rent as well. But it's a 35-year 30%, and the rents go up. But also that the tenant has to get a 20% discount or something. You know, the landlord can't be seen to be the one that's gaining all the time. But the landlord has to give a discount on rent to 30% as well.
So, and that's my kind of idea, right? Is if Limerick takes it on itself as the owner of these apartments through Limerick 2030, well, we don't have to wait for the national government to say that all apartments in Ireland or all houses have to follow these rules. The city, in this case, if it's in the city and county, if it's in Newcastle West, because it doesn't have to be just in the city centre that we do this, can actually say, we want long-dated apartment rentals. I mean, a favourite scheme of mine, which I've never managed to pull together yet, is to try and get over this problem in Ireland that you tend not to have pensions that are as large as they are in the continent. So it's dangerous to rent after you reach retirement. But it shouldn't be impossible to work with the private insurance business, who do life insurance all the time, that you pay your rent over your working life in an apartment until you're, let's say, 65, but that the insurance continues to pay your rent afterwards for so long as you live. And if you live to 110, the insurance company loses. If you live to 67, then the insurance company gains. But you get to stay in your apartment for your whole life without this fear that I think a lot of people have, that I can't rent, I need to own my house, because actually then I might find myself unable to pay rent if it keeps increasing. And I just think that if the state in Limerick ended up being the owner of 2,000 or 3,000 apartments or more, depending on our size, I think it could discipline the private market firstly in a very important way. But more importantly, it could be innovative about dealing with the types of issues that people are facing.
I think what you said there is really important about state-owned accommodation or in housing will put pressure on the private sector, because at the moment, I suppose, with rising rent costs and that being such a big fear for people in the city, that state housing, as you said already, will, if enough comes into supply, which hopefully will in the coming years, that then puts pressure on private landlords to lower their rates, which then allows people, I suppose, to have more options and to pay less. But also, I think a big thing right now is because there is such a lack of housing in Limerick, people living and tenants are scared to report certain things to the RTB just because they don't have the options to move somewhere else, or they're afraid their landlord will kick them out, or their landlord will raise the rates. And I think there needs to be more, I suppose, of a discipline on landlords, and I suppose an eye kept on the RTB to make sure that tenants are protected in certain ways, because at the moment that doesn't always happen, and I think people are scared to speak up. But as you said, I think the modular housing idea is a great thing, because long-term ideas are great, but the short-term is really important, because people are leaving Limerick at a rapid rate. A lot of my friends are living in different countries. A lot of my friends live in Australia. My girlfriend, who I've been with for 9 years now, lives in Australia. She's a healthcare worker. She left, one, because of housing, and two, because of the state of the healthcare system here. And a lot of them, they talk about never coming back to Limerick or never coming back to Ireland. And that's a really sad thing to hear. And I think this idea of having modular housing gives someone like me and hopefully people abroad hope that, yes, there's going to be housing here coming in the short term. And then after that, that'll be a stepping stone to create something bigger that's going to create this 50,000 new home, or 50,000 new people housed, and then on to 100 or wherever we go from there. But yeah, I think this short-term idea is really good.
I'm going to open it to questions in the audience, but I just realised one thing, Dylan, and what you're saying is that the poor mayor is going to become the equivalent of the RTB for all of this housing that they own, and you just have to ring him up and say, I want this fixed. So there we are. I think there's a question down there. Hopefully it's for the panel and not for me now. It's like,
yeah, it's for you and the panel, actually. I have three questions to ask, really. Number one is, the first thing, I have Paddy Mulvihill, Irish Wire, Dock Road in Limerick. I have 38 employees inside there. And you going as mayor, I welcome it, because there's 2 times to set of 3, 20 years ago or today. That's first thing I'd like to say. Second thing I'd like to say, I have my staff, there's the young fellas inside there with no houses and no opportunities of houses. The reason being is I feel personally, we all talk about building. You mentioned 400,000 for an apartment in Limerick. I was born and we had 7 children, my mother and father in his house. We had 1 bathroom back in North Kerry, a small village. I'm here 40 years in Limerick now. But now our architects are over-specifying. Our architects are over-specifying. We don't need 3 bathrooms inside the house. And our architects have to come back to reality again. How much of the 400,000 does an architect and professionals' fees cost in it? I would honestly say about 100,000 of it, at least.
40% of every new property, 35% goes on taxes
and professional fees. So architects are over-specifying, totally over-specifying. And sorry, if this is an architect, I might be at you.
I can see we have a row up
I
here.
have a response.
You have a response. Okay. I build few buildings as well. I'm just after finishing development in there of 9 or 10 apartments. But the fees, professional fees, were astronomical, I can say. Next thing in Limerick, and my staff blow every morning, the first thing around the breakfast table, they'll say, what's wrong with Limerick? Limerick is a fantastic city to live in, but there's no accountability. We've done O'Connell Street. Nobody was brought to task about the cut of O'Connell Street. We went out to University of Limerick. There was no accountability of all the money that's spent outside the University of Limerick. Nobody asked the hard questions in Limerick. We buy done stores. Nobody asked the price of it or anything like it. There is no accountability. And I'm hoping John Moran, and I wish you the very best luck. You'll have my vote and all our family's votes and my staff's votes, but you have to look for accountability inside in the people that matter inside in Limerick. Accountability is the most important thing. I love all the things you said there, going back. Stop going back. Let's go forward. And there's only one thing we can't do in life. If our Lord above calls us, if you're stuck for a corner forward or something. There's a thing in the paper today, my kids sent me this evening, somebody in Limerick City Council put up an ad about Limerick hurling, and I gave it to that young fellow there, where's he? Herself, which was deplorable what they said about Limerick hurling. Somebody in Limerick City Council will be up, will be the first for a lawnmower, but the Lord Mayor. But everyone should look at it. All my kids, not kids now, they're all adults, but it's amazing what they put up in somebody in council. Whoever's the marketing manager of the council, it was a joke. That's basic, professional fees, that's basic. I said it, what I wanted to say. John, but I'm looking forward to see you doing a good job.
Thanks. I'll go first and you can come in there. There's a lot there. Before the accountant actually responds, I'll give her time to think of her answers. Or the architect, sorry. You can be the accountant too. You can deal with the accountability question. Look, I think that when we get to the question of accountability, that's one of the reasons why I fought for this directly elected mayor so hard 5 years ago, because I think it totally changes the way that local government works, the accountabilities, the people, the availability. You're going to get, it's a spoiler alert for my 4th session on the pillars, but just to mention that I am going to be proposing things like the mayor should meet, basically like we did when I was in the Department of Finance, every quarter, the public, and actually explain what has been happening and what is going to happen in the next quarter, and go through that and do that very visibly, as we did in the Department of Finance when I was there. We used to call it our school report, and we used to issue that every quarter, more at the time to the international investors and those who were trying to convince that Ireland was on a better footing. But there's absolutely no reason why the same couldn't apply locally in government. And people will know, because I've asked people to sign up to our website and they register on that. There's now over 500 people have already registered on our campaign on that. And the reason we want that is because we want to keep it going after the election, if I'm lucky enough to be chosen as mayor, so I can deal directly with people in terms of those kind of issues, and they can raise issues back. But at the moment, we don't really have a constituency, a clinic or office in the same way for the CEO of the local authority to complain about things we don't like. And that's actually why I think this is really important that we have this transfer. On the question of standards, before you come in, I just want to mention that one of the proposals in our document is that I think it's really important in Ireland that we have standards for accommodation when it's been built by the private sector, because we've seen the impact of mica and other problems, fireproofing of apartments and everything else. But I do think there's an opportunity for the state to self-regulate and not necessarily to need to be following all the same standards, because it itself is effectively going to be responsible for the favours. And one of the examples I give is that at the moment, you know, apartments in Limerick, or indeed anywhere in Ireland, are supposed to have windows that face two directions, which constrains considerably the size of an apartment block and the lifts. And that seems like a good idea if you apply to every apartment block that's built by the private sector because you want to do it. But I've said that I would love an apartment in Limerick with all the windows looking at the river. And it could be a big long apartment looking out in the one same direction over the river. And I don't think I'd be complaining that I couldn't get a glimpse of, you know, Thomond Park in the back of my window. So I think sometimes these rules can have unintended consequences. And so I have recommended that we will look from the Department of Housing, if necessary, or from the councillors, for the ability for Limerick on the apartments that we own and things like that of our own, to have our own standards that suit Limerick and aren't just one-size-fits-all standards from across that are built effectively in Dublin, where everybody knows you can build a 400,000 or 500,000 apartment and people can afford it in Malahide or in Dalkey. But that's not going to be the case in Rathkeale. It's not going to be the case in Newcastle West. And if the state is providing accommodation, particularly in those areas, I think there's an opportunity to do things differently. Otherwise, in the private sector...
Well, I think, Paddy, I think it was, you're right that a lot of buildings, apartment blocks and houses have been built with an awful lot of higher level of services. You know, we've en suites in every bedroom and so on. But I think there's a change that certainly since COVID, people are rethinking the way that they live and they're looking for simpler, easier to build spaces. I do think that we need to look at fabric standards, at how we build our external spaces, sorry, the actual outside of the building, so that they last for the next 60 years or so. I think we can simplify them internally, but I agree that often they appear to be overspec'd, but a lot of the time that's driven by the client, not by the architects. We take instruction. But as I say, I think there is a tendency now to try and simplify, and that will help with layouts in having just less services. By that services, I mean bathrooms in every apartment.
I thought you were going to find a way to blame the auctioneer and say that the auctioneer wants some of a particular sign. I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll leave it at that, because I'll be sticking around afterwards anyway if people have other questions, as will the panel. So.
Yeah, John Dolan Burns.
Hi, Don.
A neighbour of yours down the road. Just like to wish you all the best in your forthcoming election.
Thanks, Don.
One thing about what you said there about the houses, you know, and it's like the old council houses where the council actually built houses for people before. So it's like going back to what we were, right? And I think that's a great idea. Again, why it stopped, I don't know, right? For some reason, obviously, developers and the whole lot, and the government and the councils pulled out of developing houses and building houses themselves. So I think that's a great idea. The second point is that I think we need to get more people into the town and into other towns throughout Limerick at weekends and throughout the week as well, and have more activity going on. And one thing is the amount of taxi ranks, that if you go into town of a night, it's full of taxi ranks. You can't park there because of taxi ranks. We should maybe make free parking for people coming in at you know, after 6 o'clock or whatever, in the car parks or whatever, you know, something like that, you know. So.
Okay, no, well, that's good. Well, there actually are some things in the document. But one of the things, just to remind me, as you mentioned taxi ranks, is I think we're seeing more and more people actually that don't want to have to live with a car. And we want to have people able to do that in some of the other towns that we have in the county. There was a kind of a famous Twitter exchange I had recently about the bus to Croom, where I found out that the bus to Croom leaves town at 6 o'clock and you can't get to Croom or back from Croom at 8 or 9 o'clock. I actually was pointing out the bus driver at the time, Patsy, that used to set me in and out. It was that timetable then, and that we should have a bus at even 8 or 9 o'clock. And I think there is a lot of work done on getting people by buses in and around, which is really important because sometimes people might want to go into town and have a pint or two, or go to Croom to have a pint or two with their friends and come back into town. The interesting finish to that story was that his son actually, wanted to reach out to me afterwards because he had seen the Twitter account and he was watching the compliments to his dad being a great bus driver, as did Bus Éireann, it must be said. So these kind of things do matter, and bus drivers can be really important to us. So listen, I'm going to leave it at that, unless there's nothing actually. We will hang around. There's some sandwiches there for some people if they want to eat. Really appreciate everybody's attention for the conversation. We have a couple of the documents here. They're going to be available on our website. Just a reminder to you all, that website again has my name. It's www.johnmoran.ie. It's just been redone today. So I want to give a special shout out. I think some of them are here, not all of them are. The web developers that again have volunteered their time for us in terms of doing it. As everything else in this campaign, if you have any extra improvements that you're suggesting, please do. On Saturday, we will be having, after the market and after everyone's had a bit of lunch, we're going to do a very different approach again to these documents, is that we're going to have about 2 or 3 hours with some other experts that have helped me to pull this together inside in Glentworth Street, where people can come in, look at examples of other good practices in other cities, look at examples of this and actually chat. Rocky tells me he might actually have some entertainment around the corner in the commercial, because there's a big event taking place down in Steamboat Quay, and they're coming back there. So we'll just have a couple of hours hanging out and having some fun, which is about, as I said, fun-oriented development of a different type. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.